Good morning. And our new series is Game of Thrones, the Persian Empire edition. And it's great to see people all around the table. I'm always worried when it's a January, February series are always dicey. A lot of people email me that they're away. I'm very glad that we have a full house. Our topic of Game of Thrones, the Persian Empire edition, should not be taken as an endorsement of Game of Thrones, nor is it an endorsement by Game of Thrones of our series. This goes both ways. I will tell you straight out, as I told you in the emails in advance and when I announced the series during our last series, I have never watched the show. I do not ever expect to watch the show. But I have read up on the plot lines, and knowing about what's going on the show, that's what made me think of the parallels with the Persian Empire of Tanach and Jewish history. I'm not going to ask who has seen it. That's not part of this. You won't have to answer that question. But from what I understand, you're talking about a show built around the intrigues of a royal court in which different figures compete for power, descendants of one line of deposed rulers trying to come back and return to power, threats from outside forces that influence the decisions of the leaders, and yes, just like in the show, life in the Persian court involves the sorts of interactions that yield an R rating. So there's quite a bit of similarity between the show and what went on among the leadership in the Persian Empire. Now, I put on the flyer some tentative topics. I'm going to shift the order of the topics that are there on the flyer, but I expect to address all the different figures I mentioned there. We're going to start out with someone who is technically not a Persian, we think, although I'm going to explain what that means, why there's uncertainty. And that's a fellow by the name of Darius the Mede. And the Jew who he was very closely involved with was somebody you may have heard of by the name of Daniel. Shipped from there to Cyrus the Great, who is undoubtedly the greatest of the Persian kings. From there to, of course, Achashverosh, because you can't talk about Persian kings without Achashverosh of the Purim story. And then conclude with somebody with the unlikely name of Artaxerxes. Yes, it is quite the mouthful, Artaxerxes. Moshe, there's a seat right here. Artaxerxes, at one point when I was studying Talmud in Yeshiva in Israel after high school, I had a British fellow who I used to learn with, who was my chavrusa, and when we hit this name in the Talmud, we decided we were just going to name him George. That would be it. In honor of King George. And every time we had to say Artaxerxes, we just said George. And that covered it. So we're going to be looking at these four kings in particular over the course of our 4 weeks. And it's going to be very different from what we did in our last series when we talked about mental health and Judaism, which was much more associated with the personal. This is much more national. It's about the life of the Persian Empire and the life of the Jews living under the Persians. The themes we're going to see, though, go beyond history. They also speak to Jewish philosophy, the way that we look at the world. So we're going to be talking about the relationship between gods and kings, how we look at the nations around us, and what it is that we are not meant to become. Right? Much of Tanach is spent showing us what not to do. And we'll see that in terms of the Persians. In order to do this, though, we need some background on the rise of the Persian Empire, to orient ourselves within history. And that's why I gave you at the beginning of the sheet a little bit about the Assyrians and a little bit about the Babylonians. See, if you know the geography of the region, imagine for yourself you have the Mediterranean, and specifically the eastern end of the Mediterranean where Israel is located. You have two very different types of neighborhoods between which Israel is sandwiched. To the south and southwest, you have Egypt. And Egypt is stability. All throughout our history, going back to the time of Abraham and Sarah, and working our way through the period of the First Temple, and even beyond, Egypt is there. It's very hard to displace them. On the other hand, off to the east, you have empire after empire after empire. They rise and they fall. And they fight and they fall. And really, often, it's sort of, if you can think of like Napoleon invading Russia, right, and the various empires that tried to invade Russia and failed, that's what you're talking about here. All the empires to the east get greedy when they look at Egypt. And they think, we can invade Egypt and we can for sure take them. And of course, they can't. So what you have is the Assyrians rise in the east. They try to move west. Ultimately, they are defeated by the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians rise, and they fall to be defeated by the Persians. And of course, the Persians will be defeated by the Greeks, and the Greeks by the Romans, and then the Romans by, well, you can fill in the blank in terms of which cause you want to identify, but basically the Byzantines rise next. There's more to be said about that. But fundamentally what it means is you have stability in the southwest, and you have, not chaos exactly, I was thinking chaos, but then I stopped, because it's not really chaos, as much as just succession in the east. So the Assyrians are where we start talking about the east, and the east is really our focus. We're not talking a whole lot about the Egyptians in this class. But the Assyrians are a power, certainly by the 9th century before the Common Era. In the late 8th century, before the Common Era, and here I'm using the secular historical count, there are midrashim of ours which offset these dates by about 160 years, but for various reasons it's a lot easier just to work with the secular chronology, primarily because the kings we're going to mention are all known to us in history using that secular chronology. So rather than keep on telling you this year or 160 years different, I'm just going to work with the dates that the historians tend to use. So in the late 8th century, before the Common Era, Assyria invades the land of Israel. Now the land of Israel at that point is really two lands of Israel. Northern and southern kingdoms. Right? The southern kingdom is called Judea or Judah, Yehudah. That includes Jerusalem. The northern kingdom is called Israel, Yisrael. There was actually a big debate when the state of Israel was founded about what name to give the country. Should you give it Yehudah or should you give it to Yisrael? My great uncle was very active in this. He was a biblical scholar at Hebrew University at the time, and as the story goes within the family, I don't know if this is true, he cast the deciding vote for Yisrael. But I don't know why. I don't know why he picked Israel instead of Judea. I would have preferred Judea.
Isn't it the last word
in the Chumash?
Yeah.
Yes, the last word in the Chumash is indeed Yisrael, although there it's not a reference to the place, it's a reference to the nation. But you're correct. The last word in the Chumash is Yisrael, and it talks about the miracles that were performed before the eyes of all Israel. What happens is, to make a long story short, after the time of King David, who takes over the kingdom? Solomon, right? Shlomo, his son. After the time of Shlomo, the kingdom splits. His son is Rehoboam. He is the heir to the kingdom. Rehoboam is not such a wise king. His father may have been the wisest of all men, right, which puts him at 50% in the human race. But definitely his son was not. Rehoboam instead wants to raise taxes, and when people rebel, he takes counsel with his advisors, and the older advisors say to him, go easy, and the younger advisors say, show them your iron fist, and he chooses the iron fist, and the result is that he loses the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. They become Yisrael, led by a fellow named Yeravam. We're not discussing them right now, except to say that in the late 8th century, the Assyrians invade. They conquer the northern kingdom, and they exile the 10 tribes. Right? That's where we get the idea of the 10 lost tribes. Those tribes are exiled. They move in, the Assyrians move in other nations into that northern kingdom. Primarily, they become known as Samaritans because their headquarters are in the Shomron, in Samaria. And then the Assyrians invade Yehudah, Judea to the south. They take control for a short period of time. King Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, is the king in the south. He pays them tribute. Then he decides to stop paying them tribute. And he rebels. The Assyrians invade. They are halted miraculously at Jerusalem. They are going to destroy everything, and then they are stopped. And they continue their conquests elsewhere. That's not the fall of Assyria. They conquer land in Egypt, the city of Noamon. They reassert their control in Judea eventually, and finally the Assyrians are defeated in war approximately the year 612 before the Common Era. And they are defeated by a collaboration of Babylon, along with Madai Media, who we're going to talk about later, and a couple of others. There's something called the God Chronicle, God, G-A-D, which you can find all sorts of information about online. Okay, that's the Assyrians. Oh, okay. Well, after we'll figure it out, but thank you. After that come the Babylonians. So the Babylonian king, who's the most famous Babylonian king to Jews, for sure? Nebuchadnezzar, that's right, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar comes through the area trying to finish what the Assyrians started. He's not really interested in the Jews, though. What he's really interested in is getting to Egypt. That's really what his primary goal is. Nebuchadnezzar takes control of the land. There's a whole... Sorry, Muhammad?
No, it's okay.
Okay. There's a whole back and forth in which they take control of the land, they appoint a puppet king, the puppet king rebels, they come through multiple times, they exile different populations. Finally, they destroy the Beis HaMikdash, they destroy the temple. And they exile the Jews of Judea. The Jews of Judea find themselves in exile in Babylon and the lands that they control until the fall of Babylon. And that's where the Persians start to come into play. The secular version of the fall of Babylon goes as follows. There was a nation called Media. You can spell it M-E-D-E-A. You can spell it M-E-D-I-A. However you like. I find it gets confusing if you use an I when you talk about the Media Empire and the king of all media and all that. So I prefer the E. But Media was a nation that was based in what is today northwestern Iran. In the 7th century before the Common Era, 6th century before the Common Era. And the secular version of it is that the Persians conquered the Medes under Cyrus the Great, also known as Cyrus II.
Who's Cyrus?
So Cyrus is a Persian king. Yeah, we're going to have to talk a lot about him next week. So, Koresh, correct. The last Mede king was a fellow named Astyages, and Cyrus is actually his son-in-law, according to the historian Herodotus. But Cyrus defeats the Medes, and then he turns and defeats the Babylonians. That's the secular version of the history. However, the account of it in Tanach is different. The account of it in Tanach is actually that the Medes and the Persians combine to conquer the Babylonians. But what do you do when two nations work together to conquer somebody else? Who's the one who's going to be in charge? Who's going to be king? You can't have them both. In those days, this was not the era of democracy, right? You're not having a coalition government, and you have these ministers and you have these ministers. That wasn't the way it worked. You have one king and one king only. If you have more than one king, you run into the problems that we ran into in Tanakh when Saul was still king and David was coronated. You don't want to play that. So the question was, what do you do? And Darius the Mede is actually the first king after Babylon over that land that had been the Babylonian Empire. He's the first king, he is a Mede, and he's the last king from Media. After that, they're all Persians. That's the idea. There's a lot of discussion about this in terms of who Darius the Mede was historically, because the historians don't know about anybody named Darius the Mede. We have him in Tanakh. Historians, if you ask them about Darius the Mede, they look at you and they, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what there were Persian kings named Darius. There were Persian kings named Darius. There are midrashim that say that Darius, the Persian, was actually the son of Ahasuerus and Esther. Right? We're going to talk about Darius in a couple of weeks, but that's a Persian Darius. So the question is, who is this Darius the Mede who we're talking about? So there are different suggestions. Some suggest he was the father-in-law of Cyrus the Great. Others suggest that that Darius was just a throne name, like Pharaoh is a throne name for different people. So Darius could have been a throne name, and he was actually somebody else. There are all sorts of different suggestions, but that brings us to where we are for the class today, which is Darius the Mede. as his story is told to us in Tanach, is the first post-Babylonian king. At some point, we should really do a class on the Babylonians, because there's so much to say about them. None of it nice. But that's simply going to have to wait. Right now, we are on the Persians, and after 15 minutes of history, let's see what happens here with this, and why I call this a Game of Thrones type of story. So our story picks up. Do people have the sheets? I realized that I printed based on the registration list, right? We had 27 people registered, so I printed 35 sheets, and I think we're a little north of that. But I'm going to, as always, for those who haven't been at the series before, I always send out an email afterwards with the source sheets and with a link to the audio recording, so you'll be able to get the source sheets that way. If you're not yet signed up, if you're not yet registered with your email address, make sure I have it, please, after the class. Okay. So, Darius the Mede. Take a look on your sheet, please, at source number 3. This is the beginning of the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel. To give a little bit of background on Daniel before this moment, because you really need to know something about him before we just jump into chapter 6 of his book. Daniel was a Jew of the Davidic line, from the royal line. He has the misfortune to be an up-and-coming teenager at the time when the Babylonians sweep through under Nebuchadnezzar and they exile the leadership of the Jewish people. This is before the temple has been destroyed. In an attempt to cut off the head of the Jewish people, he said, the Babylonians say, we're just going to take your leadership and exile them. Nebuchadnezzar wants a trophy. He says, I want a symbol of my victory over the Jews. And so what he does, and this is in the first chapter of the book of Daniel, he says, bring me young Jewish males who will stand in my court. They will learn our script. They will learn our language. They will eat the food off of my table. I will give them Babylonian names. And this will be my trophy. Daniel is selected along with 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. What are their Babylonian names? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, precisely. They're more famous than Daniel's Babylonian name. What's Daniel's Babylonian name? Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar is his name. It means Baal, which is a Babylonian god. Baal will protect. All of the names that are changed are somehow associated with Babylonian religion. That's the idea, because their names are all Jewish names. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, these are all names that invoke God. Daniel, they all invoke the Jewish God. Get rid of those names and give them Babylonian names instead. Daniel refuses. He says, I'm not interested in being your trophy. Now, he doesn't have a whole lot of control. Nebuchadnezzar is a brutal man, and he doesn't go along with things like that. But Daniel says, I'm going to make a stand, I'm going to take my stand by refusing the food off of the king's table. Well, the king's waiter says, I have no interest in getting my head chopped off. You're going to eat the food. And Daniel says to him, listen, here's the deal. It's a longer story, but he says, you can take the food home to your family. Just give me vegetables. All I want are seeds. We'll be fine. Give me a 10-day trial to see how we do. See if anybody can tell the difference. And that's what he does. On a vegetarian diet for 10 days, he looks great. Commentators differ as to whether he looks great because vegetarian diets are healthier than the king's table, or whether it's a miracle. But Daniel and his friends go vegetarian in the king's court. Then, after that, we find that Nebuchadnezzar has a frightening dream. He summons his court. He summons all his advisors. And he says, here's the story. You're going to tell me what I dreamed, and you're going to tell me what it meant. And if you don't, he says, I'm going to chop you up into small pieces. That's not like my exaggeration. That's actually what it says. This is a brutal, vicious, horrible human being. And they claim, they say to him, look, no one can tell you what you dreamed and what it meant. Tell us what you saw, and then we'll explain it. And he says, no, you're just stalling for time. And he begins the executions. Word gets to Daniel, this kid. He's about 15 years old, according to the commentators. And he says, I can take care of this. And he prays to God. And has a vision in which the dream is shown to him and explained to him, he goes and tells Nebuchadnezzar and he halts the slaughter. And at that point he becomes very important in the Babylonian court. But what happens when you become very powerful in the Babylonian court because you've done something that nobody else could do? What do you gain? Enemies. We don't like this upstart kid from those Jews we conquered having such a close relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. But there's nothing they can do. Daniel can do no wrong. So that in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another scary dream. And once again, Daniel explains the dream. And then after the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the next king recorded in the book of Daniel in chapter 5 is named Belshazzar. And Belshazzar, not Belshazzar, which is Daniel's name, Belshazzar, same concept though. Belshazzar is either the son or grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He's having a big feast while at war with the Persians and Medes. And during the feast, something happens. What happens? Exactly. Hand comes out and writes on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekal Ufarsin, which means, essentially, measure for measure, right? Measure for measure, ultimately, you're going to be punished. There's more to say about the message and why no one else understood it, but Daniel is summoned, he explains the message, and then the Babylonian Empire falls. And that brings us to chapter 6. By the way, I realized I jumped right into the class because I was so agitated about not starting on time that I forgot to do my thank yous in the beginning. So I'm going to do the thank yous now before we launch into the text. First of all, I want to make sure to thank Beth Emma for making this class possible and all the series that we do, and especially Pearl Grunland, who I work with to get everything set up. I also want to thank Ron Becker, who has sponsored the series, as he has sponsored all the series in memory of his father. And okay, thank you all for being here as well. Now, let's launch into chapter 6. You see on your sheets, chapter 6 is in source number 3. I only gave you the English there. I did not give you the Hebrew original. Why didn't I give you the Hebrew original? Because it's not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic. That's correct. Chapters 2 through 7 of the book of Daniel are actually in Aramaic. So if you want, I could, but then I would also have to go onto another page, which you know is one of my rules. I try to avoid that if I can. But yeah, it's not in Hebrew. So let's take a look at the story. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom. He was approximately 62 years old. Is that anybody's business? Is that your business to know he's 62? All right. He's approximately 62 years old, as the text said. Kivar shnin shitin v'sartin. It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps to be in charge of the whole kingdom. In the Aramaic, these are Achash Dar Penaya. Those who know the book of Esther will recognize that word there as well. It's a term for a Persian official. He has 120 officials who are in charge of the kingdom. Over them were 3 ministers. Okay. One of them was Daniel. These ministers are called sarchin, which are dukes in other languages. Okay. So you have 120 people who report to these 3, to whom these satraps reported, in order that the king not be troubled. So Darius the Mede is going to rule over the former Babylonian Empire, but he has layers of authority beneath him so that he should not be troubled. This man, Daniel, surpassed the other ministers and satraps by virtue of his extraordinary spirit. The king considered setting him over the whole kingdom. Darius looks around and says, Daniel does good. I like this one. The ministers and satraps looked for some fault in Daniel's conduct in matters of state, but they could find neither fault nor corruption, inasmuch as he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. That's the explanation that the GPS translation gives. In the original Aramaic, it's Ila u'shchita. Shchita, like the word shinchet taf in Hebrew, would be something corrupt. Ila is a cause for something negative. So no negative claim is to be found in him. There's nothing wrong with him, unlike most leaders of the time, and frankly of most times. Daniel is not in it for himself. Right? This is something that we've discussed on other occasions. Daniel is very much a model for the Jew who has power in a foreign land. He's not the only one. Esther and Mordechai and Joseph, right, are models biblically as well for this. And there are certain commonalities between their stories. Right? One quick example, since Purim is not far off. Right? What's the special food that people eat on Purim? Hamantashen. Right? Hamantashen. Why Hamantashen? No, it's not his head and it's not his hat. We don't know if he had a three-cornered hat. I'm an American. I grew up learning about the colonies and the colonials with their three-cornered hats. Haman did not necessarily have a three-cornered hat. Yeah? Right. Good. Tashin are pockets. In Hebrew, they call it Oznei Haman, Haman's ears, but that's a later interpolation. That's not original. Haman Tashin were originally called Muntashin. Poppy seed. Mun are poppy seeds. They were poppy seed pockets. What does that have to do with Purim? The only food I can think of with Purim is wine, right? Because all the feasts in the beginning of the story, Achashverosh makes a 180-day feast with wine. I don't think they're having poppy seeds at his party. What does that have to do with poppy seeds? Oh, you can. That's true. Sorry. It's not an opium association.
That's him hiding the seeds.
Good. So the truth is, the story goes back to Daniel. Daniel eats seeds. Now you'll say, well, what does that have to do with Purim? And the answer is that we're told in the Megillah with Esther that she was given different things. Vayeshaneha. She was given something mishuneh. She was given something that was different. Says the Midrash that like Daniel, who's just a little bit before her historically, but like Daniel, Esther also would not eat the food in the palace. She went vegetarian. She had the seeds. So that's the origin of Hamantashen was with the poppy seeds. Personally, I prefer the prune ones. But everyone's got their own favorites. But that's where it comes from. So there are a lot of associations we make between these stories. Okay, but going back to Daniel here. The members of the court, the advisors, are jealous of Daniel. But let's go look at the story a little more closely. I joked that it's no one's business how old Darius is. But really, why does the text tell me his age?
Because that's old.
I think he doesn't know what he's doing at this old age. That was old in those days, not.
So Marlene says, because it's unusual. Gloria says, because I might think maybe he's already not so focused on what's going on within the kingdom. If he's 62, maybe he isn't already up on what's going on in the kingdom. I will personally take umbrage on behalf of everybody here who is 62 or older. But that's a concern. Marilyn, you were going to say?
Well, because the Bible often mentions how old Moses was and when he died. So this relatively young man. Some were 100, they were 120. Sarah was supposedly 110. So 62 is like middle age, maybe.
So when you go earlier in biblical history, you do find more of a focus on people's ages. This is true. And you find people living longer. Also true. But by the time you hit this point in history, you're not seeing ages recorded in that way. This recording here in the book of Daniel, I think, is the only age we actually find in the book. We're told that Daniel was young, and youths were requested. But it's only by extrapolation from different things that we figure out that he was a teenager. We don't know it from the text. No one else gets their age mentioned. And in the earlier books that describe the kings from the end of the First Temple period, generally you don't know their name. There are exceptions. There's a king who takes over at the age of 8. So we're told that. And there's a regent who's in charge. Because, at the age of 8, you're also not so up on what's going on. Generally, we don't know age. Age is here because it's part of the story. There's something about this that matters. So Gloria suggests maybe it indicates he's not so up on what's going on. Diane?
What happened 62 years before then?
What happened 62 years before then? And the answer is we don't have information. We don't know. There actually is such an idea in some of the commentators that it has to do with trying to show his age relative to when the temple was destroyed and Daniel was taken. And there actually are commentators who go that route. But I'm going to take the approach of Don Isaac of Barbanel. I like quoting Abarbanel, and I want to make sure that people understand who he is, because as a historical figure, he's fascinating. He was a leader of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula in the latter half of the 15th century. Starts out in Portugal. Exiled from Portugal, he goes to Spain. He's a very important man in Spain, Minister of Finance for the government of Ferdinand and Isabella. And so important that when in 1492 Torquemada succeeds in getting the Jews expelled from Spain, the king says, you can stay. And Abarbanel does everything he can with his leverage to try to prevent the expulsion from Spain. He succeeds in delaying it for a period of time, but ultimately the expulsion goes forward and he goes into exile with everybody else. His son was actually held hostage. There's a whole other story involving that to try to keep him from leaving. But he goes into exile and he goes to Italy. And he becomes a leader there as well. He was known by other Jews of his time, leading scholars of the time, called him HaNesher HaGadol, the great eagle. Right? Although Nesher technically is a vulture, but you don't want to call him the great vulture. But he was the great eagle for the protection he gave to the Jews in his day. Sorry? So there are different versions of vultures. There are different species of vultures. There's the bearded vulture. There's this vulture, that vulture. Yeah. The zoology and ornithology are fascinating. But Abarbanel writes commentaries to various books within Tanach. Not all of Tanach, but much of Tanach. And a lot of what he writes is geared towards speaking to the Jews of his day who are going into exile and who are suffering under the nations around them. His commentary to Daniel, interestingly, is not written as Daniel comments to Daniel. He actually names it Ma'yanei HaYeshua, which means Ma'yanei. Ma'yan is a spring, good. The springs of salvation. Because he sees in Daniel the roots of the arrival of Mashiach, the Messiah, because the way the book of Daniel works is that the first 6 chapters are stories, and then the second set of 6 chapters, there are only 12 altogether, the second set of 6 chapters are all visions of the future, and he saw in it predictions of the arrival of Mashiach. But in any case, in terms of what's going on here, Abarbanel likes to give insights, sometimes in his role as a member of the king's court, and sometimes in terms of messages for Jews who are living in exile and are suffering. So take a look at source number 6. Is it number 6? I wonder what I did here. No, that's not what I wanted. All right. I must have taken it off the page in the interest of fitting everything in. So I'll tell it to you outside the text. Abarbanel says, it's not on here. Abarbanel says that the king is old. That's the issue. 62 is old to take the throne, and that's an explanation of why he appoints people to govern in his place. He has 120 satraps, and he has 3 people over the satraps in order to insulate himself from the day-to-day, because he doesn't have the energy to be involved in running this massive empire. Other kings don't tend to do this. Clear? That's what's going on. And that matters a great deal because of what comes next. Go back to source number 3, please. The second paragraph. Then these ministers and satraps came thronging in to the king. JPS is creative in their use of verbs. I didn't even know thronging was a verb. They came thronging into the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the ministers of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, companions, and governors are in agreement that a royal ban should be issued under sanction of an oath, that whoever shall address a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den. So issue the ban, O king, and put it in writing, so that it be unalterable as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated. Right? The Persian kings do not like to go back on their word. We know that from the Purim story. Thereupon King Darius put the ban in writing. So what is it that they demand? For a 30-day period, if anyone wants anything, they have to ask you, O king. Why does he go along with this? Because he will. Why does he go along with this idea? What? Sorry? Ego. Right. Here he is. He's the new king of the great empire, but no one's coming to him because he has all these layers of hierarchy that are meant to shield him, to insulate him. But the downside of having this insulation is, are you really a king? Right? So he's a puppet, essentially. That's what it looks like. And so that's what they convinced Darius of. The king who is opposed to micromanaging and direct governing still needs a sense that he is still the king. And so, take a look at source number 4. A midrash tries to explain what it was that was said to him to make him go along with this. He, the person convincing Darius of this, said to him, "Therefore you're not a king. All kings make decrees and issue laws, as in," and they quote a verse from Daniel, "like the law of Media and Persia. And you have never issued a decree." And when he heard this, he came to terms with them. He says, "You know, you're right. I think this is what I need to do." Rashi, in his commentary, puts a little bit of a different take on it. He says, the goal was to strengthen the king's law by force. You're new to the king and you're foreign. Right? Because the Persians and Medes just took over the Babylonian Empire. You need reinforcements. That's the idea. Abarbanel, with his spin as a member of the royal court in source number 6, says the following. He says, "They counsel that no one should seek his needs from any officer or courtier, but only from the king himself, so that to the entire nation the king would be the source of kindness and mercy." So I don't want anybody going to officers. I don't want anybody praying to their gods. Everything has to go through him. Why only 30 days? A test? He'd be overwhelmed, right? Sarah says, he'd be overwhelmed. Are you really going to do this forever? You can't run a kingdom like this. At any age, it doesn't make a difference. You can't, that's no way to run a kingdom. This is simply something symbolic. Much the same way that Nebuchadnezzar earlier, his first frightening dream was a dream of a great big statue with different layers to the statue. And the gold at the top represents Babylon. And then there's silver and then there's copper below it, and representing different empires which would rise to take the place of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar made a great big statue of gold representing Babylon. And he said everybody has to bow to this statue. Not forever, but for a particular period of time. He wants a symbolic commitment that people are going to be loyal to his throne. That's what Darius is looking for. Clear? Well, this is not random. For the advisors who did this, these ministers and satraps who came thronging into the king, I'm going to say that as often as I can, who came thronging into the king, their goal is not really to support Darius. What is their goal? To tear down Daniel. How is that going to work? Not the food. Prayer. The prayer. Take a look at source number 7. We continue the story. Palace intrigue indeed. When Daniel learned that it had been put in writing, he went to his house, in whose upper chamber he had windows made facing Jerusalem. And 3 times a day he knelt down, prayed, and made confession to his God, as he had always done. Daniel says, I'm going to keep on doing what I have always done. Isn't he worried about being caught? Right? I mean, he's doing it by the window. So Abarbanel says, yeah, but normally he prayed out in public, and now he did it in his own apartment. Yeah, thinking he'd wait out the 30 days by doing it in private. But realistically, you're right by the window. Notice, by the way, that where does he pray towards? Prays towards Jerusalem, right? That's our practice. Praying towards Jerusalem. Why? The Beit HaMikdash, the temple. Tell me something. Is there a temple in Jerusalem at that point in history?
No, it's destroyed.
It's been destroyed. The Babylonians got rid of it. Take a look at source number 8. Flip the page, please. From the book of Melachim, of Kings. This is from the speech of King Solomon when he dedicated the temple. He turns to God and he says, when they, the Jews, sin against you, for there is no man who does not sin, And you are angry with them and deliver them to the enemy. And their captors carry them off to an enemy land, near or far. And then they take it to heart in the land to which they have been carried off, and they repent and make supplication to you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned, we have acted perversely, we have acted wickedly. And they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of the enemies who have carried them off, and they pray to you in the direction of their land which you gave to their fathers, of the city which you have chosen, and of the house which I have built to your name. Solomon, when he dedicated the temple, said, the Jews in foreign lands shall pray towards Israel, they shall pray towards Jerusalem, and they shall pray towards the temple. And that's why Daniel does it, and that's why we do it.
It sounds like Yom Kippur.
Yes, actually, it does. With the references to repentance and asking for forgiveness, absolutely. The site retains its holiness even in destruction. And so Daniel continues this. Notice as well, prayer 3 times a day. Right? Shacharit, Mincha, Ma'ariv. Shachas, Mincha, Ma'ariv, if you like the Ashkenazi approach. But this is the earliest source that we have that shows a Jew praying 3 times a day. Meaning the Talmud links prayer with the fact that Abraham rises in the morning to speak to God. With Jacob praying to God at night. Isaac going out before the evening to speak in the field. But nowhere do we have an explicit mention of Jews are supposed to pray collectively 3 times a day. This is the first mention of it, and it says, as he had done before. He did this already in the time of the temple. If you take a look at source number 9, I brought you from the Talmud. It's fascinating. They use this as the basis for the way that we pray today. The Talmud says one should always pray in a house with windows. As it says, and windows were open for him. Perhaps one should pray all day? No, it's explained via Daniel 3 times. Perhaps he started only upon entering exile? No, because the text says, as he did before this. Perhaps one could pray in any direction he chose, so it says opposite Jerusalem. So we learn practical rules for the way we pray based on this story with Daniel. Okay, so back to our story. Right? Daniel has gone to pray before God as he always had done. Back in number 7, we're at the 2nd paragraph. Then those men came thronging in and found Daniel petitioning his God in supplication. So this is a plot. Right? They're watching to see. They catch Daniel, and they then approached the king and reminded him of the royal ban. Did you not put in writing a ban that whoever addresses a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den? Right? And he says, I'm 62, I'm not senile. I know. He says, the king said in reply, the order stands firm as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated. Yes, I did make such a rule. Flip the page. Thereupon they said to the king, Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, pays no heed to you, O king, or to the ban that you put in writing. 3 times a day he offers his petitions to his God. That's what they said in response. He's not listening to you, and he's not listening to your decree. I apologize for the reference to senility. That was not funny. But why did they need to say this to the king? Why did they frame it this way? Why didn't they say to him right off the bat, Daniel isn't listening? That's not what they did. They went to him and said, don't you have a decree? Why did they do that?
He likes Daniel.
Because the king likes Daniel. We said he was looking to put him in charge of everything. So they do this in a way that the king can't back out. Can you confirm we have something on the books about not petitioning God or man? Yes. Well, we just watched Daniel pray by his window. You can watch too, 3 times a day. Right? That's what they say to him. You have no out. Upon hearing that, the king was very disturbed, and he set his heart upon saving Daniel. And until the sun set, made every effort to rescue him. He's trying to come up with a way, something he can say. Until the sun sets. Why only until the sun sets? He does it until the sun sets, because at that point Daniel does it again. Here I am trying to find a way around it. Maybe you didn't see what you thought you saw, whatever it is, and there he goes by his window, praying towards Jerusalem. Then those men came thronging into the king and said to the king, no, O king, it's a law of the Medes and Persians. Any ban the king issues under sanction of oath is unalterable. You're out of luck. This is it for Daniel. So that's our intrigue. The Jew has gotten himself a position of power. He has raised the jealousy of those around him. They take advantage of the king's style of governance to say, you really need to be more hands-on. You should make a decree that everybody has to come to you for 30 days, knowing that this will trap Daniel. Daniel walks right into the trap. He has to know what he's doing. And they have sealed it now on the king. Take a look at source number 10. By the king's order, Daniel was then brought and thrown into the lion's den. The king spoke to Daniel and said, "Your God, whom you serve so regularly, will deliver you." A rock was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his signet and with the signet of his nobles, so that nothing might be altered concerning Daniel. You have a dual sealed stone. Why do you need the king's seal and the seal of the nobles?
Everybody's in agreement. It's not just the king, it's the whole country.
Isn't that everybody's in agreement? Why do you seal things? To prevent tampering. You seal things because you don't trust. Each side doesn't trust the other. Abarbanel's insight. Take a look at source number 11. Perhaps the king instructed placement of the stone out of fear of the night, lest those men kill Daniel with a stone, a fist, or sharp arrows. He doesn't want them to walk in and kill Daniel themselves. The officers also sealed the stones so that the king could not send quantities of food to the lions to cause them to leave Daniel alone. Neither side trusts the other. And that's why you need it sealed. That's what's happening here. As a Barbanel, again, a veteran of a king's court, he knows what he's talking about. So they seal they seal the stone. Daniel is stuck inside. Back in source number 10. The king then went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and his sleep fled from him. The king's upset. He doesn't want to lose Daniel. Then at the first light of dawn, the king arose and rushed to the lion's den. As he approached the den, he cried to Daniel in a mournful voice. The king said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, was the God whom you served so regularly able to deliver you from the lions?" Notice at the first light of dawn. That's not when kings normally get up. Daniel then talked with the king. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, who shut the mouths of the lions so that they did not injure me, inasmuch as I was found innocent by him. Nor have I, O king, done you any injury. I have done nothing wrong. I have not done anything against you, O king, and God has saved me because I'm innocent." Notice that he says, God saved me because I've done nothing wrong, including nothing wrong to you. My God looks after you, O king. If I had done something against you, then my God would not have saved me. That's what he says. And the king was very glad and ordered Daniel to be brought up out of the den. Daniel was brought out of the den, and no injury was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Happily ever after? Not so much. Not so much. Here's an epilogue in source number 12. Then, by order of the king, those men who had slandered Daniel were brought and, together with their children and wives, were thrown into the lion's den. Because Persians, Babylonians, fundamentally they're all the same. And there's a cruelty to them that we observe here. Not only the people who slandered Daniel, but also their children, also their wives, are all thrown into the lion's den. Similarly, Daniel's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were thrown into a fiery furnace. Because, remember that gold statue I mentioned that Nebuchadnezzar created to represent Babylon? And he said when you hear the music, everyone has to bow to it. Daniel is out of town for that story. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are in town. They refuse to bow to this statue. They get thrown into the furnace. And when they emerge alive, the people who had ordered them thrown into the furnace get thrown into the furnace instead. And that's what you see happen here. They're thrown into the lion's den. They had hardly reached the bottom of the den when the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Why do we make a point of that? Besides, Game of Thrones style violence. What's the point?
Well, how to deal between Daniel being saved and how fiercely they were attacked? It wasn't like these were lions who wouldn't attack. It shows as a miracle that he...
Right. It demonstrates that it's a miracle. These are not tame lions. When the advisors came thronging into the lion's den, they met their fate. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples and nations of every language that inhabits the earth, "May your well-being abound. I have hereby given an order that throughout my royal domain men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God who endures forever. His kingdom is indestructible, and his dominion is to the end of time. He delivers and saves and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." It's really striking, this acceptance of God that you see here. Now, you might suggest these are Jews telling the story, but we're going to see this with King Cyrus the Persian as well next week. This idea of, for the peoples of that time, accepting and endorsing multiple gods. The Persians, which we'll see next week, are Zoroastrians. God of light, God of darkness, that's their belief. Nonetheless, when they conquer the Babylonians, they endorse the Babylonian god. We'll see this next week. We'll talk about the Cyrus cylinder. And we will find Cyrus endorse the God of the Jews as well. In other words, this is not entirely strange that he would say something like this. But why does he send this letter? What's the point of sending the letter? What is he trying to do?
Validate Daniel.
Sorry?
Validate Daniel.
To validate Daniel, yes.
Spread the word to his people.
Spread the word to his people. Could be. Make it official. Could be. Barbanel has this very interesting idea. I don't know what his source is. Yeah.
You know how they said before how you couldn't change a rule once the rule is written?
Yeah.
Maybe, sort of the Prompter was saying they couldn't change the rule, but then they said the Jews could fight back. So maybe he couldn't undo what he said before, but now he's sort of changing it up.
So Shauna's point, I think, is well taken. It could be that he's countering his original decree this way. He can't rescind the decree, but by making this statement of loyalty effectively to the Jewish God, maybe now he's made it acceptable to be able to pray. That could be what's going on here. Barbanel has this notion, which I don't know what his source is, that already at this stage there's a willingness to return the Jews to their land and allow them to rebuild their temple. The next king, Cyrus, is actually going to do it. So maybe that's part of what's happening here. Particularly interesting, yeah.
Why did you refer to him as the living God?
That's a term that's frequently used in biblical texts to refer to God of the Jews, in contrast with the idols, which are the dead God. Yeah. So, what are we supposed to take away from all this? It's a dramatic story, right? Makes for good reading. The Christians love this story, Daniel in the lion's den. They're very into this story. But what are we supposed to learn here aside from the history and the story in Tanach? What are we supposed to take away from all of this? Yeah.
These have fun, faith in God. God will, belief in God, and God will save us.
Right. Faith in God when you're in exile is for sure one of them. Look, Daniel stayed steadfast in his service of God, and God took care of him. That's one. What else? Yeah.
What's the backstory for what happened next with Cyrus?
Backstory to prepare us for Cyrus could be. Although, frankly, I would have liked to have seen it then in Divrei Hayamim or in Ezra, as opposed to seeing it in Daniel. Ruth.
There's a jealousy that exists in exile of the Jews.
There's a jealousy of the Jews who are in exile, and it's specifically, though, jealousy of somebody who excels in the palace. I think you're learning a lesson here about the dangers of palace intrigue. The Talmud builds on this. It says, you know what? Daniel disappears after this story. The rest of the book after this is Daniel's visions. We know nothing about what happens to him afterwards. And the sages comment on it and say he's brought down by what we call ayin hara. Ayin hara not meaning a superstitious sense. That's not what we're talking about. But rather, ayin hara meaning literally the evil eye. When someone is jealous of somebody else, eventually they will act to bring them down. And Daniel ultimately does not make it past this story. Stephen, and then Linda.
Not that we're referring to Yul Brynner, but is it in Tanach that Pharaoh said, "Your God is God"? If it is, then this is another incident of God being accepted by a leader of the time, not a Jew, as being universal.
Right. So what he does say is Hashem HaTzadik v'ani v'ami harashayim. That's what he says. God is right, and I and my nation are wicked. So that's the statement. Not quite Yul Brynner's words, but we'll go with it. By the way, that's actually a perfect segue. We're still on this series. We have 4 weeks of this series, but the series that's planned for February, March, we've now established will be 4 weeks of Passover preparation. It's going to be Passover at the movies. Depictions of the Exodus in various films. What they got right and what they did not get right. So look forward to that in February, March. But in terms of this class, one lesson that we learn is if you're loyal to God in exile, God will act on your behalf. A second lesson that we pick up here is the dangers of palace intrigue. Even if God is on your side, it's still a dangerous game. You think you're in another land and you gain influence, you should use it. Be really careful about how you use your influence. It can in the end tear you down. Linda, you were going to say?
No, that's what I was going to say. Is telling us in effect that we should keep a low profile.
Yeah, that's correct. It's the value of a low profile. And the third lesson and last is about cruelty. Right? Again, we are not supposed to be like the Medes. We are not supposed to be like the Persians. And every time they are shown in this kind of bloodthirsty way, right? You throw them in and you throw in their wives, you throw in their children. It's meant to be a lesson to us. Don't become like that. That's not who you are supposed to be. And we'll see that, well, the truth is we'd see it best with Nebuchadnezzar, but we'll see more of this kind of negative example when we get into Achashverosh, when we get into Artaxerxes, George, the other kings. We'll see that more. But next week we see Cyrus. Cyrus is a political wizard. We'll see his interaction with Zerubbabel, a leader of the Jews in his day, and that's a remarkable story in its own right, so please tune in next week. Once again, if anyone didn't register, especially if I don't have your email address for our list, please do give me your information. Thank you very much.